don't think that's his fault. It's from somewhere by his house.
Okay.
We need a louder duck, don't we?
Yeah, we need an amp for this.
Hey, you guys, let's get started here.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Reasonable Faith, featuring a new wall plate so that the projector doesn't break all the time. They fixed it. I'm sorry that I forgot the drinks tonight. They're in my apartment, but we'll have the same drinks next week. Before we start, a couple of things. This Saginaw Conference, the Unapologetic Conference in close to Fort Worth, is happening in 2 weeks. It's next Saturday. Right? Or is it the Saturday before that? Right? No, it's 2 Saturdays. Okay. It's in 2 Saturdays. Okay, it's been confirmed that it's in 2 Saturdays. We'll all go together. Eventually, we'll send out a thing and ask how everybody wants to get there, and we'll put that together. And it'll be a good conference, and this will get you in for free. Just remember that. There you go. And let's see. So tonight we're talking about prophecy and inspiration, and I found out an interesting tidbit as I was reading from oh my goodness, what's his name? Alan Schleman, who is an apologist who focuses primarily on Christianity versus Islam. I learned just this week that sort of in contrast to what the Bible talks about, the Quran includes several anachronisms about crucifixion. And this is an interesting thing because, the Quran basically relies on, for its own accuracy, this claim that Jesus was not crucified. But it's actually, there's some evidence that the author of the Quran was not really aware of what was going on with crucifixion. So he includes several references to historical events where pharaohs or people in authority in the Middle East crucified people who were opposed to them. But all of these examples, except for the one of Jesus' crucifixion, took place several hundred years before crucifixion was even invented. So that is an interesting point where you can mention that if you're speaking with a Muslim who mentions that one of the reasons that you should trust in the Quran is because it has some unique scientific knowledge or something like that, which I think can be said about the Bible, although it's kind of a risky apologetic claim to make. You can mention that sort of anachronistic reference to crucifixion that demonstrates sort of a lack of understanding of what was actually happening instead of basic historical reliability. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting thing to start off with, in contrast to something that's not necessarily historical knowledge, but historical foreknowledge. And we're going to talk about that tonight. So take it away, Alan.
Okay, thanks, Kenneth. Yeah, I like this topic a lot. I'm excited to talk to you guys a little bit about prophecy. We're going to try to look at the more evidential type prophecies and show some interesting things that you may or may not have heard yet. A lot of what I learned in grad school at Biola. I had a professor, Dr. John Bloom, and I have a book here that's really good that's got some of these in detail in it. So let's jump in. First of all, I'd like to make the case that you can show the Bible is inspired just from the Bible itself. That may sound like, oh, there's no way you could do that unless it's circular. But if in fact you can show prophecies that were written way before the fulfillment for things that are not likely, etc., I think you can make a case that you have some evidence for divine inspiration. And in fact, a prominent atheist philosopher, now deceased, J.L. Mackie, agrees. He says, successful prophecy could be regarded as a form of miracle for which there could, in principle, be good evidence. And more importantly, Jesus actually made the case. He said, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. So he's pointing to the Old Testament at this point, obviously, right? And that's what we're going to focus on today, and saying, look, there's some things the prophets talked about that should get your attention from an evidential standpoint. All right, but let's think through this a little bit. Like, what would this evidence look like? Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I want to get some feedback from you guys. Would these be good examples or not? Okay, here's one messianic prophecy. Messiah would ride into Jerusalem on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Is that very evidential? No, why not? Yeah, I mean, he could have been, it's self-fulfilling, right? It's like, and in fact, I think you could argue he did want to do that on purpose to fulfill the prophecy as a way of showing that he is the Messiah. That was his way of showing it. So there's nothing that makes this look like only God could have inspired Zechariah to write that, right? So it's not really an evidential prophecy. As a Christian who thinks there's a lot of evidence for trusting God's word, I believe it was a prophecy, but it's not an evidential prophecy. It doesn't help us for the case we're trying to make today at all, in fact. Okay, what about this one? Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Yeah. This one, I mean, Bethlehem, it actually was a pretty small city, but it's hard to get a lot of real solid evidence. I mean, I trust the Bible, and that is some level of evidence, but if you're a hardcore skeptic, they're going to just say, oh, well, they just wrote that in there because of the prophecy, right? It makes it a little bit harder to, I would say that, it's not like it's zero evidence, but it's like it's pretty weak for a skeptic. If you're trying to help someone who doesn't even maybe believe in God, doesn't trust the Bible, it's not going to get you very far for that particular example. So what would some good criteria be? What do you guys think? What are we looking for? I kind of mentioned a couple of them in passing a while ago, but Ashton. Okay, yeah, you've got to make sure that it was actually fulfilled. What else, Rob? Yeah, it's very important that it has to be ahead of time. Josh? Okay, yeah, kind of getting at what we were just talking about in terms of like someone forcing the fulfillment. Okay, yeah, those are some good points. And also, I would say, it has to be very clear. Nostradamus has a lot of predictions. You need to, they can't be too vague. Now, some of them in the Bible, admittedly, are not super clear, and sometimes there's like the Bible talks about something that happened at that particular time, and then there's also like a future, more deep fulfillment. But yeah, the ones we're going to look at today, we're looking for just the subset of biblical prophecies that are pretty clear. And yeah, they have to be known to be made before the fulfillment. So that would discount, for example, the Mormons talk about Columbus, but their oldest text dates to 1824. So it's of no value at all, evidentially. And it can't be that just the predictor or his followers forced to fulfillment in some way. And it should be something that would be hard to have been guessed. I mean, if you predict a city will be attacked militarily, big deal. Almost every city eventually is, right? Yeah. It will be hot this summer in Texas. Yeah, I mean, it's got to be something that is a little bit unusual. I did put out in the announcements a couple of links if you really want to dig in deeper. There's a method, an argument. There's like 4 Ivy League PhD scholars put together this material, and they first establish a methodology. This is a summary of it, but they're a lot more detailed. Then they give a lot of examples, far more than I have time to get into tonight. So there's both the data and the methodology.
If I could add one that's actually not from a prophet.
Okay.
If I recall correctly, Moses during Passover, and there was an offering of lamb, and he spoke about no bone shall be broken of the Messiah. And the practice of the Romans were to eventually break the legs of those that were crucified to
Verify death, because you had to push up to breathe. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Okay. All right. Now, let me a little background before we get into specific prophecies as well, with respect to the dating of these. So a lot of these were written a long time ago. It's harder to verify anything when it's this old. But thankfully, in the 1940s, we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. and we found copies of all but one of the books of the Old Testament. And some of these dated, the 2nd century BC. So they were, well before Jesus or well before some of the fulfillments we'll talk about today. In other cases, we'll talk about fulfillments that weren't quite that recent, but still the fact that these documents agreed with the Jewish copies around the world points to it being very unlikely that, there was all of a sudden some successful effort to change Ezekiel or Daniel or whatever and make sure that all the copies you find wherever in the world are consistent. Actually some documents there were even as old as the 3rd century. The only book they didn't find was Esther, the one book that doesn't have the name of God in it, which is kind of interesting. And those documents actually did agree quite well with the Masoretic texts, the oldest copy that we had of the Hebrew Scriptures, which was from Leningrad. In particular, the Isaiah scroll is famous for having, because of its completeness, and they matched it, and it was 95% of the words were identical. Most of the ones that weren't, it was just spelling or tiny changes. But in addition, I would point to the translation of the Septuagint, which started in the 3rd century BC. And so they made a copy into Greek of the Old Testament. They translated it through a team of people, maybe 70 scholars, if you believe some of the historical accounts about it. So that's another way of you can cross-check these documents. And it wasn't as though what they had and what the Hebrew text had were divergent. Obviously, there's some differences, but in terms of these prophecies that we'll be talking about, you're not going to see missing details or things like that pertinent to the prophecies. So let's look at it for the first example. We're going to look at a prophecy about Edom, that it would perish, both the people and the nation. So it's a pretty strong claim here. There was actually 6 prophets in the Old Testament that foretold of the doom of Edom. The Edomites, you might remember, these were the descendants of Esau, and they lived south of Israel in the desert. I'll show you a map in a minute here. But the most detailed prophecy says, because of violence to your brother Jacob, remember Jacob was renamed Israel, so the country is kind of really speaking of the country Israel here. And you will be covered with shame. You will be cut off forever. Cut off is a euphemism for killed. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gate and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. There was some treachery against Israel for which God judged them. And then there's this strong statement, there'll be no survivor of the house of Esau. This is in the book of Obadiah. The whole book basically is dealing with that topic. But there's other prophecies as well. Okay, as background, and here you can see the map of this area down here. It's about the size of New Jersey. And it's really an interesting area because they built some things into the side of a mountain here. You might have heard of Petra and seen pictures. In fact, does anybody recognize that from a movie? Yeah, Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade is filmed there. So there you see Harrison Ford and his dad. So have you been there?
No, I've seen pictures, but
Yeah. Yeah, imagine if there was valuables, people would have, plundered them long ago, I guess. But I want to go there. I've never been there. I think Justin Bass has, though, because he used to live in Jordan. We should ask him when he talks. But anyway, so the fulfillment. So after the Jewish-Roman wars, this would be referring to, in 70 AD, Jerusalem fell. There was this huge war. The Idumean people, this is the name of the people that lived there in terms of the way secular people refer to them. They disappear from written history, though the geographical region of Idumea is still referred to at the time of Jerome, which would be centuries later. So I quoted Wikipedia here, not because it's some great scholarly source, but more to just show the accessibility of tracking down this kind of info, you could read the Bible, you can check it. Yes. No, they weren't. I mean, they themselves at this war were being killed and deported and very weak after that. So it's not as though they just killed all the Edomites or Idumeans. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think this reference is referring to like the last traces disappearing, but yeah, I think it was a severe hit somewhat before that. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned this is, even though it's in the desert, it's actually a very key route for caravans because you could actually get water along the route, plus the ability to defend yourself in the natural kind of terrain there. So it was so desolate that Petra was unknown to the West until the 1800s. The Bedouin knew about it, but most of the scholarly West didn't even really know that it's still there. Here you can see the caravan route in red. That's Edom right there. You can kind of see it maybe better on that map that I threw in there. So to be able to, for these people to actually, be fully killed and wiped out is a little surprising, given the fortress that they had there and so forth, and prophesied by Israel at a time where they were in captivity. Yeah, Ashton.
Because the Romans had the Roman roads, there were so many trade routes. People just went around. Like, why go through?
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, and so like it slowly just went out of popularity. They went bankrupt, and everyone just moved somewhere else. But
yeah, it became incredibly desolate, just as was prophesied. Okay. The next example I'd like to mention is prophecy about Babylon. Okay, and again, there's several different books of the Old Testament where you see references to this prophesied destruction. From the book of Isaiah, we see it says, "And Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the glory of the Babylonians' pride, will be overthrown. She will never be inhabited." So again, you're seeing like a really strong claim here. Here, it's not even just saying like those particular people will die out or something that lived in the city, but just that the actual land will not be inhabited. And also later in Isaiah, it says, "I will turn her into a place for owls, and into swampland I will sweep her with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord Almighty." In Jeremiah, it says, "No rock will be taken from you for a cornerstone, nor any stone for a foundation, for you will be desolate forever." So a lot of, the ancients were quite good at recycling because of the lack of building materials, or often if a city was destroyed, maybe by an earthquake or war, they would just use those stones again, right, obviously, and rebuild things. And so it's very rare if you would have a situation where you still have the original stones just kind of lying around. But you'll see in a minute that that's exactly what we have. Just kind of background on Babylon. And again, when this was prophesied in Isaiah and Jeremiah, Israel was just this tiny kingdom. Babylon was quite powerful, in like the 570 BC timeframe. They were really ruling the world and just incredibly powerful, both militarily and economically. Here's a picture from 1932, before they even did some of the archaeological stuff there, where you can see the stones are actually still there. It's in quite a state of disarray, but it's not as though people have, rebuilt or even really harnessed the stone for other purposes. As one scholar says, "All that remains today of the ancient famed city of Babylon is a mound of broken mud brick buildings and debris. In 275 BC, the inhabitants were deported to Seleucia. History comes practically to an end by 141 BC. It was in complete desolation and obscurity. Now, one reason it wasn't inhabited later is because the Arabs in the area, they had a lot of superstitions about it because it was such a major, destruction, sudden downfall of Babylon. They were very superstitious about it. People did not want to really go there. And that's why you had a lot of animals come in, like it mentioned, the owls and so forth. So that kind of explains the why behind it. When they were trying to excavate Babylon in the 1800s, they couldn't dig up parts of it because it was under a water table. So we see the swampland aspect. Now maybe that part's not terribly surprising since it was on a river, but still that it would infiltrate large parts of the city could be a little less obvious. Now the closest it came to ever being rebuilt was when Saddam Hussein rebuilt he built some buildings as a tribute in 1985, but then they had the second Gulf War and it wiped out a lot of what he had built. So, I mean, and if you look at, the 1932 going back to like 100 BC, it's a huge time span of just like nothing going on. Somebody built a few buildings, they get destroyed. I don't think it really counts as a disfulfillment of that prophecy. And so I do find this one to be pretty unlikely. That was one of our criteria as well, right? Could you predict that this most powerful city in the world would be destroyed and never be rebuilt? I mean, that's pretty surprising when they were the largest, most fortified city in the world at the time. They had a very powerful empire. Now, empires come and go, but that you would have this main capital destroyed so incredibly and not be rebuilt, that I think is surprising. It had double walls. The outer wall was 300 feet high. It was said that you could have horse carriages turn around on top of the wall. Really incredible. The palace alone was bigger than most cities in Palestine, just literally the acreage that it covered. But yeah, if you consider, you have all these tributaries of the Euphrates River going by there. As you know, this very dry in modern Iraq here. And so why wouldn't somebody want to reestablish some civilization along the river there? It's pretty surprising. Turning next then to Philistine, you might remember, oh, go ahead, Seth.
I was just going to ask, what exactly did lead to the destruction of Babylon? Like, what nation caused it to fall or destroyed it?
Well, they fell pretty suddenly. I mean, the book of Daniel even gets at it a little bit. You had the Medo-Persians coming in. It's kind of
the ones that destroyed the city, or
they didn't really destroy it. It was more taken without.
Isaiah 13 is about Assyria coming to destroy the kingdom of Babylon. And so it could have been fulfilled multiple times. So like the first half, also Isaiah's prophecy, a lot of prophecies are like this, it's poetry. And so there's a lot of images about the sun and moon being darkened, which didn't literally happen. And in some ways, Babylon is personified. It says that mankind will be made rarer than gold. It's very dramatic. So some of it I would say is hyperbolic.
Sure.
Second half, though, about it never being inhabited again, I think was fulfilled much later. So it's like a dual fulfillment of prophecy.
Right. I would agree with that. Yeah.
What history says is that Babylon was destroyed or taken over by the Persian king Cyrus the Great.
Yeah, but there wasn't a lot of destruction from that particular event, and you're asking more about the destruction now.
yeah,
huh?
was it uninhabited after the Medo-Persians came in, or was it later? Because it mentioned on that Wikipedia thing that history basically ends after people were transported into Seleucia. Or
Yeah, they weren't. Yeah, it was still inhabited.
So was it more of an Alexander the Great kind of time period where it got destroyed?
It was even after that a little bit. Well, okay, no. As far as the destruction of a lot of the, before it was permanently uninhabited was, after Alexander the Great. And by the way, if it wasn't, I wouldn't be able to use it as an example because I'm looking for things that are far enough afterwards. So there's a lot of prophecies where what it's predicting in the Bible happened so soon in time, we can't really verify it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just wondering.
So yeah, it seems to be the case that there was a judgment on Babylon. They lost the power, and then the Assyrians came in later and did more destruction, and then eventually it was so completely destroyed, and people were just evacuating.
That was the Babylon. I thought it was the Babylonians who conquered the Assyrians.
Yeah, the Neo-Babylonian. But there's when Isaiah was writing, there was Babylon the kingdom, and when it was just a city-state, and then that was destroyed by the Assyrians, and then Nebuchadnezzar makes it come back, and then he gets destroyed again.
Right, because I guess Isaiah is like
Isaiah's pretty
700s
early.
BC. That is quite a long time before. Okay, fair enough.
Okay, Philistines, let's talk about them a little bit. You might remember Goliath, of course, is one of the more famous Philistines. These were the seafaring people that lived on the coast, and in fact, Gaza that you hear so much about. It's one of these Philistine cities. So these people lived in the time of, especially like when King David and Solomon were around, and Saul, you had a lot of battles between the Philistines and the Israelis. But we're going to go a little bit beyond that in time and look at Zephaniah, which was written quite a bit later than that. But it says Ashkelon, one of these cities, there's 5 main cities in Philistia, said it will become a desolation. The remnant of the house of Judah will drive sheep to pasture on it. In the houses of Ashkelon they will lie down. So it's actually predicted that many Jews will live in Ashkelon. Unlike many modern-day Israeli cities, few Arabs actually live in Ashkelon. It is predominantly Jewish. Overall, there's about 20% of Arab population in Israel living, for the most part, pretty peacefully and comfortably within Israel, unlike the ones that are not. Okay, so yeah, this has been settled by over 100,000 plus Jews. And then with respect to Ekron, it says it will be uprooted. And so this is an example of a case where the original city is just completely gone. There's not a, current day city, and certainly the Philistines themselves no longer residing there. They're not even totally sure, archaeologists aren't, which of different candidate ruins correspond to Ekron, but pictured here is kind of a leading candidate for where it might have been. And they had to obviously excavate it. It was buried, and there's not like this is in the middle of a big city or something. Now, a lot could be said with respect to Israel itself. There's several places in the Old Testament where God told Israel if they rebelled that they would be exiled. You might remember even going back to Deuteronomy, there's a lot of, long list of, here's blessings on you if you follow God, and there's these curses even on Israel if they don't. They were given so much revelation from God, seeing, the deliverance from Egypt and so forth. They agreed to be held to a higher standard in some sense. And so God tells them there that they will be scattered among all the peoples from one end of the earth to the other if they didn't follow God. All right? And so we actually, I think, see this fulfilled quite clearly as well, in that of all the people groups in the whole world, none are as remotely scattered as Jews. There's Jews in Australia and the US, and obviously a lot went to Europe and Asia. They're just, and Africa also, Ethiopia and different places. There's been many persecutions of Jews where they had to flee and go to new areas to live. And so this is pretty unique, actually, that you have a people group retain its identity and yet be so spread out throughout the world. And so that was predicted in the Bible, that they would retain their identity as people and not be completely destroyed. Even though you see Israel coming under God's judgment, you see it speaks about a remnant of Israel and so forth throughout the Old Testament. And in Leviticus it says, yet in spite of this, when they're in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or abhor them so as to destroy them. common theme that you see in the Old Testament. They sin against God, they come under judgment, but he never totally forsakes them. So despite the long-term residence in different countries and isolation from one another, most Jewish populations were not significantly different from one another at the genetic level. Most Jewish communities have remained relatively isolated from neighboring non-Jewish communities. I remember listening to a course online at MIT, and the professor was talking about how the genetic studies actually did show that the Jews did not really appreciably intermarry, many of the Jews that were spread out in these different places. So they have some interesting genetic studies on that. In fact, this is kind of interesting that it was actually prophesied that if Israel rebelled, they would be shipped back to Egypt and sold into slavery. And that did literally happen en masse in 70 AD after the Titus conquest of Jerusalem. A lot of the survivors that didn't already flee anyway, virtually all of them were shipped to Egypt, and we have secular accounts of how, the price of slaves went way down. There was a lot more supply all of a sudden than demand, which is kind of interesting. Now, the whole book of Hosea, this is one of the ones detailed here. This is the case where the prophet Hosea was told by God to go and marry a prostitute, Gomer, and it was symbolic, it's clear in that text, of Israel as like the prostitute that's prostituting themselves with other men. Israel's forsaking Yahweh to pursue other religions is seen by God as sort of like an adulterous act. That's a common theme of the Old Testament. And so this was yet another case where God's trying to get them to come back, forsake their ways, don't be adulterous. And within that, there's several interesting things that are clearly laid out in Hosea 3. It says that Israel would not be self-governing. They would lack the ability to sacrifice, which happened obviously when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. That ended that. They became largely non-religious rather than worshiping other gods or idols. So just like if there was someone who was adulterous, there was a time period after they left their adulterous partner before they would be accepted back. So in this case, Hosea had to wait on Gomer, and it's this whole thing is an analogy, and it's clearly spelled out, I think, in Hosea for the relationship of Israel to God. And so you have these different features also, just like in a relationship where Israel would not, they would not be that religious for a while, which we've actually seen as well in terms of many Jews being more secular and irreligious. Not all of them, obviously. You have some Orthodox Jews, devout Jews, but many of them, statistically, they're more likely to be agnostics and atheists than many other people groups in the U.S. And in Ezekiel 36, it says, I will take them from the nations, gather you from all the lands, and bring you into your own land. It has been prophesied in the Old Testament that Israel would come back to their homeland. And for a long time, this was used against the Bible, like just saying, look, here's a failed prophecy. And it did, admittedly, it took a while, right? But Israel was born in the aftermath of World War II. In a very sudden way, Israel became a state. And it really, I think, goes along well with Isaiah 66, where it says, who has ever seen such a thing? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. And so that seems to be a fulfillment of that, even not just that Israel became a nation again, but the sudden nature of it. Yes?
Couldn't that be considered like a self-fulfilling, since it was like the development of the state of Israel was facilitated by what?
That's a good question. Yeah, I would say that there's some merit to that, but if you think in terms of how irreligious most Jews were at the time of the fulfillment, the vast majority of them were not going to Israel to try to fulfill that prophecy. They were really fleeing from persecution more than anything else, I would say.
Right,
so I would say that it might diminish the force of it a little bit, but there are some factors that seem to go beyond just self-fulfillment.
Didn't the U.S. also have a pretty heavy hand in the establishment of the modern nation of Israel?
I thought Britain too. So
Britain did, yeah. But again, I would argue they were not, the people doing it were not trying to fulfill the prophecy. And in fact, from what I understand, yes, they it probably wouldn't have happened if you didn't have some people in the U.S. and Britain, especially Britain, trying to help it happen. But they weren't nearly as supportive as you might have thought, actually. Seth, what did you have to comment about that?
I was just going to mention the fact that it's not like all the Israelites just got around and decided, oh, let's make a nation again, and just boom. Like there were many other world powers at play, and yes, Britain and America, I'm sure, were large parts. Even back then in the 40s, I doubt large swaths of both governments were in some kind of conspiracy to fulfill a Christian prophecy.
Exactly.
Because they wanted to.
Yeah.
Christian / Jewish prophecy. And also, that Israel could have easily rose up into that nation and immediately gotten steamrolled by all the other nations around it, which it miraculously.
We're going to talk about that on the next slide. Yeah.
War, so.
Yeah, I mean, I say it does diminish the evidential for some that they wanted to create a nation. But you bring up a lot of good points. The other thing is, even if you want to, what are the odds that you could actually carry it out, right? I mean, it's pretty amazing that it actually happened. So yeah, May 14th, 1948. So it was pretty, I would almost call it miraculous, the details of what happened, because, the day they became a state, there was a number of Arab nations that declared war on them and came in. And Israel didn't have much support from Britain or the US in terms of even like bullets and war. They were very much on their own up against more populous neighbors. And of course, this has happened other times historically, as you can see from the map there. But yeah, the number of immigrants to the country, it's just been incredible, the number of people that have come there, 5 times the number who were there. And of course, that's grown even more. And it actually was prophesied as well in Zechariah that nations of the earth will be gathered against it. And there were, as I mentioned, there were 5 nations that attacked Israel just the day they became a state. It was just like right out of the box. They didn't have much in the way of organization or military things to try to help defend themselves. But eventually their military did become strong, and they won numerous wars against more populous Arab neighboring countries. There's also an interesting prediction in that, when the early Christian church was mostly Jewish, of course it did start off more Jewish, right? Because it's an outgrowth of Judaism that was predicted in the Old Testament. But it was predicted in Romans 10, Matthew 8, that most Jews would not accept Messiah, that Gentiles from around the world would. And obviously we've come to see that. There is also prophecies about in the very end times, many more Israelites will come back to God and follow God. Ashton.
Yeah. And he brought up Isaiah 66. I would have to read those passages more in context, but I know Isaiah 66 is about the end times, because I know that chapter concludes with discussion about like God's final judgment. So I don't know if that would qualify as maybe a double fulfillment, or it just doesn't seem like a full fulfillment of those passages. I think when they talk about Israel being gathered again, they mean it not so much as a state, but like for a final time after they accept the Messiah. God will restore them finally.
I'll admit it's not super clear, but the fact that you have like multiple verses where it seems to be talking about them, going back to the land, becoming a country in a very sudden, dramatic way. And I mean, you say it's about the end times, that would show that that verse wasn't talking about something would happen, just 1,000 years or something after it was written. It's been more like 2,600 years. So in a sense, that could be sort of end times like, even if other things it talks about are subsequent to that. Mike, what are your thoughts?
I'm having a hard time understanding, like, what exactly did make it so quick?
I think part of it was, you had a lot of Holocaust survivors. It's like, what do we do with them? Where do we put them? How do we deal with this? But there was also a lot of opposition. There was a lot of politics.
Who made those decisions?
The UN primarily, right?
Yeah, I'm not real up on all the details of like the Balfour Declaration and some of the past going back further. But I think it did kind of catch the world by surprise from what I've studied. I think everyone would admit, like, hey, this did happen fast. And I think a big key part of it is probably the Holocaust. Everybody knew a lot of Jews suffered. There was still, I mean, in fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but there were Jews in concentration camps in Germany well after the war. Sadly, the U.S. and other countries were not as good as they should have been at just kind of helping refugees get better situations. So,
Well, surely Jewish, let's say, power and influence, 'cause if I say money, then that's being anti-Semitic, and their hatred for the Palestinians had a lot to do with it, because when this happened, it displaced Palestinians from their land, and you get what we have today, a small enclave of Gaza, which is all in rubble, and the rest.
it's
So I'm sure
certainly a mess over there right now, yeah.
They're heavy on lobbying here in the U.S. government. So, England, yes, of course, but Israel or better yet, I should say, is I had a visit from an Israeli friend, and he drew a line between Zionists and Jews. So I should say Zionists, not Jewish.
Okay. Was your hand up, Kenneth? Or?
I had a couple of thoughts. If
Yeah,
we have time.
please.
Of course, it's not a response to that.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into there's a lot of political stuff, and I was more just trying to look at the 1940s situation. And I can't explain exactly how they became a nation, but I do think it was pretty sudden. It caught the world off guard, and I don't think there's any evidence of people conspiring to do it to fulfill a prophecy. But go ahead, Kenneth.
You want to go ahead, Byron?
Go for it.
Oh, okay. To put on my hat of non-Catholic Catholic apologist.
Okay, it's an interesting hat.
The Roman Catholic Church and a lot of the mainline Protestant churches would generally say that the church, either largely or completely, has replaced the nation of Israel, or at least been fully grafted into this idea of the thematic nation of Israel in the Bible. So I would wonder how you would respond to that idea that it's not necessarily this one ethnicity that is the ultimate the ultimate object of these prophecies. And then in addition to that, I would be kind of curious about the extent to which the modern state of Israel actually does fulfill these prophecies, because I look at Ezekiel 37, and this is actually something that was talked about in a retreat I was at this weekend. But the prophecy says, I will gather them from all around, bring them to their own land, and I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them all, and they shall be no longer two nations, and no longer divided into two kingdoms. They shall not defile themselves anymore with their idols and their detestable things, etc. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God, and my servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd, etc. And I just don't see very much similarity between the modern state of Israel and this particular prophecy, because we don't have one king, we have a liberal parliamentary democracy in the state of Israel. And also, like, no longer divided into two kingdoms. This area is extremely divided into two kingdoms. So I'm just curious whether it can be chalked up to a state of sort of selective quoting or something.
I would say with respect to that Ezekiel 37, I think it's referring to the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah.
Yeah.
And so in the sense that modern Israel doesn't draw that distinction, I would say that could still qualify as a fulfilled prophecy, even if parts of that, arguably haven't yet, or that kind of a thing. I would think also that I wouldn't read too many details into the description of a king versus just trying to convey to the people there that there's some kind of, at least there's a unity now between Judah and Israel.
Okay, yeah. And do you have any overall ideas theologically behind the idea of
with respect to that part of your question,
as it is right now? Because
I
that's
would
just
think,
something I don't see yet.
Yeah, I think you're right that a lot of prophecy, there is something to the notion of, the modern church is now playing the role that Israel had a role as the chosen people of God that the modern church more broadly now fulfills. Israel was supposed to be a light to the nations, and now even more so the modern church is supposed to fulfill the Great Commission to make it known to all peoples. So I do see that, but I do think some of those prophecies are referring to the Israel people themselves as well.
Sure.
And I don't claim to have it all figured out though, or know which ones are which or whatever.
It's a really
but
hard hermeneutical race.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What do you think, Ashton? You have some thoughts too?
Well, actually, I had some thoughts on the previous slides. So you went over the prophecy in Isaiah about Babylon being destroyed. I just kind of looked it up a little bit now, but Isaiah actually celebrates the prophecy coming true, specifically all of it, including the parts about it never being inhabited again. And it just makes me wonder how did Jews in the intermediate period between the full destruction of Babylon, where it's completely abandoned in Isaiah's prophecy field, especially when they were in exile. And I think it's important to recognize that a lot of Old Testament prophecy, because it's poetic, is hyperbolic. So the stuff about Babylon never being inhabited for generations to generations could also just be a long stretch of time. It's not going to be inhabited for a while. And I mean that was true after Babylon was destroyed. The native inhabitants of Babylon did not inhabit it again. And then the Chaldeans, which were a separate group of people, actually moved in and took over. Nebuchadnezzar, who founded the Neo-Babylonian Empire, was not a Babylonian, he was a Chaldean. And so Babylon as a people, not so much the city, but as a people sort of ceased to exist after the city-state of Babylon was destroyed by Assyria. And I think part of the trouble of reading Old Testament prophecy, if you read it a little bit too literalistically, is it sort of motivates a desire to find future fulfillments. But I think the fulfillments of a lot of these prophecies are a lot more near to home, nearer to when they were first articulated.
It is also complicated by the fact that sometimes there's multiple levels of fulfillment over time. I was trying to think of an example. There's an example I heard, I can't remember at the moment, but where you can see clearly both that the prophecy was fulfilled, but that there's also a sense in which the deeper prophecy is not fulfilled until later. I think that's a common occurrence as well. But I find, in the case of Babylon, I find it pretty interesting that, what it's saying did literally become fulfilled. Now, the fact that you do have some hyperbole from time to time. In the book of Joel, it talks about, you were talking about the sun darkened, moon turning to blood, and that's mentioned in Acts. And we do see some things like that which are shown to be hyperbolic. So I guess it just demands, we need to look at each area individually and see if we can tell. It may be the case. I mean, in this case, it's just, I find it really amazing that it's, it literally did have an eventual fulfillment. So I think that's worth some level of evidence anyway. All right, let's move on so we don't run out of time. I'll just gloss over this. This is just interesting that the Jewish people have been a blessing to the world. There's a number of Nobel Prize winners, things like that, and then obviously the spiritual blessings of bringing the Bible and Jesus. But I want to get into one last example that I think is a good evidential prophecy, even though skeptics would claim this is a failed prophecy. So one of the questions I get sometimes when I make presentations on this topic is, well, what about, there's an expectation that I've just picked, these best examples. There's a whole bunch of failed prophecies out there or something. One of the more common ones skeptics cite is actually Tyre, with respect to a city in modern day Lebanon called Tyre. So I want to look at that a little bit, and you guys can see what you think about that. So what they'll usually say is that, and we'll read the predictions here in a little bit. What they'll say, though, is that Nebuchadnezzar didn't do all that was predicted in destroying Tyre. And even though Tyre was predicted to never be rebuilt, there is a modern day Tyre. Those are the two common kind of refrains. So here's a depiction of what it might have looked like long ago. It's a city in the Phoenician Empire. And there's an old Tyre, which is on the coast in the background there. This doesn't show many inhabitants there, but there generally was a number of people living there. New Tyre was this fortified island about a kilometer off the coast. And here's the main prophecy we're going to focus on. It's from Ezekiel 26. Behold, I'm against you, O Tyre, and will bring up many nations against you, as the sea brings up its waves. They shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers, and I will scrape her soil from her and make her a bare rock. She shall be in the midst of the sea, a place for the spreading of nets. For I have spoken, declares the Lord God, and she shall become a plunder for the nations, and her daughters on the mainland shall be killed by the sword. Then they will know that I am the Lord. For thus says the Lord God, behold, I will bring against Tyre from the north Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, and with horsemen and a host of soldiers. He will kill with the sword your daughters on the mainland. He will set up a siege wall against you, and throw up a mound against you, and raise a roof of shields against you. And then it goes on, he will direct the shock of his battering rams against your walls. With his axes, he will break down your towers. His horses will be so many that their dust will cover you. Your walls will shake at the noise of the horsemen and wagons and chariots. When he enters your gate as men enter a city that has been breached. With hoofs of his horses, he will trample all your streets. He will kill your people with the sword, and your mighty pillars will fall to the ground. And then interestingly, and I've underlined this, as you see, it changes from second person to third person. They will plunder your riches and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and destroy your pleasant houses. Your stones and timber and soil they will cast in the midst of the waters. And I will stop the music of your songs, and the sound of your lyres shall be heard no more. I will make you a bare rock. You shall be a place for the spreading of nets. You shall never be rebuilt. For I am the Lord. I have spoken, declares the Lord God. All right, so I would argue that we do have pretty clear fulfillment. Now we have a bit of a time issue here because with respect to the part of the prophecy dealing with Nebuchadnezzar, in the book of Ezekiel, this was literally like 1 year in advance. So we don't really count the fact that it's mentioning Nebuchadnezzar as being evidential. In fact, when you get to chapter 29, he's writing after Nebuchadnezzar has attacked. So we're focused more on the longer term fulfillments within here. The bare rock. But notice it had, many nations will come against you as the sea brings up its waves. So it is predicting not just that Nebuchadnezzar is going to wipe out the city, but you'll have waves of attacks, waves of destruction, eventually leading to this dramatic destruction where everything is cast into the waters, your stones, timber, soil even. Why would you cast soil into water? Think about that. We'll see in a minute. So Nebuchadnezzar, he wrecked the old Tyre, but he didn't have a way to get to the island nation of Tyre, the island city, I should say. That survived until Alexander the Great in the 300s BC. But notice, the text did not indicate Nebuchadnezzar would accomplish all of the destruction. We go from he to they. A lot of scholars think that, well, that's obviously the transition to subsequent things. So what happened historically, but Alexander the Great didn't really have much of a navy. And so to take New Tyre, and he was very offended by the the people of Tyre for reasons we won't get into for sake of time. But what he did is he wiped clean the mainland part of Tyre. He took all the debris, threw it into the ocean to try to make a path to the island. So literally, even the soil, you would want to dump soil too, right? Otherwise, why would you be messing with soil? This took him like 11 months. And he even built siege towers on top of this platform. We have, secular evidence. We have historical records about this happening in some level of detail. So today, where Tyre once stood as a relatively small fishing village and part of the original city is actually underwater. Now, this is probably the most instructive thing to show you. You have the old Tyre completely demolished. They threw the debris along here and just kept trying to build it up. So he built this causeway where he eventually was able to conquer the city, killed thousands of civilians. He was really mad at them because they caused him all kinds of problems. Part of the city's underwater. Now, over time, you have currents bringing sand in here, and so it's building up. So the present coastline, sorry about that. Present coastline has actually filled that in, so there's no longer an island part of the city there. Hit the wrong button there, but this whole thing is land now. So I happened to be a scuba diver. I was looking around like, I wonder if you could dive and see this, and I found, and sure enough, there's several pictures of divers that do dive and see the ruins of ancient Tyre. So the biblical prophecy about it being, being destroyed, thrown into the waters, we have evidence you can see even today with regard to that. Now, it could be bothersome here that, was Tyre rebuilt? Ashton brings up a good point. Sometimes in these kind of poetic languages, there is a lot of exaggeration. Maybe that's all it was. But I would argue that if you just look at the text for what it's actually saying, it's really saying that Phoenician Tyre would not be rebuilt. Like, those people are not going to rebuild their city. That, if you build something different and it's different people, that should not count as it having been rebuilt. And we do see evidence actually of literally fishermen spread their nets in some of these areas. So the Phoenician city of Tyre was utterly destroyed. The Phoenicians are gone. The modern city in Lebanon on the mainland is not a continuation of the city that was destroyed either culturally, ethnically, or especially structurally. It's not as though they pulled out those things that were thrown into the ocean and rebuilt with them. I mean, that wouldn't make sense anyway, but so I don't think this is a failed biblical prophecy at all. In fact, I find it interesting because of some of the specific nature of things mentioned there. There's a photo from 1934 where you can kind of see it got filled in. You can see it was pretty uninhabited at this time. A more modern picture, they never were able to rebuild the harbor that was the queen of the seas, as is talked about in Ezekiel. It's more of a fishing area. There are a number of people living in parts of this, but not, there's parts that are just ruins and there's parts under the water that are ruins. So it's not as though they're even on the same exact land. So if you're going to break out your scorecard here, I would say that many nations coming against Tyre, it's a pretty clear prediction and fulfillment, and we have the time frame right. It's not particularly unlikely, but a little bit, maybe the degree to which you had waves of these nations coming against it. The city flattened like a bare rock. The degree to which that happened, I would say there is pretty unprecedented in other areas. Because they were motivated to throw it into the sea, they took a lot more than normally when you just destroy, walls of a city or something. It really was scraped bare. Place to spread fish nets also has some evidential force, even if it's kind of a minor detail, maybe not terribly unlikely. The Nebuchadnezzar attack, we can't really count that because of the time frame. Stones cast into the sea, I would say that's clear prediction, fulfillment. Time frame is right, and that's a little less likely to guess at. Never rebuilt. I'd say that I might even make this green, but if we're trying to be super conservative, we could say, well, it's a little bit debatable. But that's kind of how I would rate that one. Yeah.
I'm just curious why, or if you have a particular sort of framework that you would use to justify saying, like Babylon will never be rebuilt, period, but Tyre will never be rebuilt by the same culture.
I mean, if you look at the prediction, or the like in Isaiah, when it's talking about Babylon not being rebuilt, it's talking about the stones not even being used, and it says no inhabitant. Whereas here, it's talking to Tyre, and they're very proud, and God's condemning like their pride, and so it's a judgment on a particular set of people. So I think there is a clear distinction in the text, but that's a good question, because it could look like, oh well, you're cherry picking or something. All right, in summary, this is the last slide, and we'll wrap it up here. I didn't go over Egypt today, but the first week, if you were here, I mentioned a couple things from Memphis and Thebes that are very specific that are fulfilled, that there would be no idols in Memphis. The Muslims tore those down, and so that happened much later and not motivated by Jews. And then Thebes, many would be killed, no mention of idols ceasing. You see a ton of idols and statues and so forth in Thebes today. Even Edom perishes as a nation and people. Babylon destroyed and not rebuilt. Stones left, not recycled. Philistines, we see a couple of specifics about cities. Israel, we have some things there. Some of that may be less evidential than others. But I think overall, if you think in terms of what nation is more scattered than any other, what example, do you have no other examples historically of people being so scattered for long periods of time and then coming back together? I think it is pretty remarkable. And then also all the opposition in order to, stay alive, actually. Tyre, so I think we do have some specific and unusual predictions there as well. All right, here are some references that I've already posted. If you're on Discord, you could download those, and as well as this book. If anybody wants to check it out, I could loan it to you. That's all I got. Any last questions or comments?
I do have a question.
Yes.
If I may kindly and respectfully prelude my question with the mission, our mission on Reasonable Faith's website. It says, Reasonable Faith aims to provide in the public arena an intelligent, articulate, and uncompromising yet gracious Christian perspective on the most important issues concerning the truth of the Christian faith. Then it goes down and there's a few things that anybody can read to access it. I think fourth from the last is the reliability of the Gospels, the uniqueness of Jesus. I don't even know what they're trying to say there with the uniqueness of Jesus, but they say Jesus. And the historicity of the resurrection. So my question is, why during your whole entire presentation were there no messianic prophecies provided for us, for those of us that might not know any or might know a few? And again, going back to concerning the truth of the Christian faith, I need not say Christians, the basis of Christianity, of course, is knowing Christ, understanding that there are many messianic prophecies that point towards Christ coming, and what he went through, and what he was here for.
Okay.
So my question is,
Why?
I mean,
Okay, it's a good question. I can address that.
Other than the very beginning when you just threw up, hey, Bethlehem, the donkey. Other than that, there was, I mean, you didn't even go into the prophecies of that. You just said, hey, Bethlehem, hey, the donkey. So other than those two things, I'll give you that, but I'm just asking why.
Okay, it's a good question. Yeah, let me see if I can give you some inputs to see what you think. But
No, I'm just asking why you didn't include it. I know Hainline is not as far as I know, not a Jewish last name. And I say that, and anybody can judge me for whatever reason, but if you have insight, Jews do not consider Christ as the first Messiah. So I don't think you're a Jew. We're a Jew.
I am not a Jew, no.
Maybe you would have deliberately omitted messianic prophecies, but I don't believe that.
No, I was, okay, let me say that, first of all, we have had entire weeks devoted just to messianic prophecy. And we'll probably likely do that again. And so we definitely are believers, big believer and advocate for that as well. What I was trying to bring before you today was some of the more evidential prophecies that you can find in the Old Testament. Now
there's evidential prophecies in the Old Testament, multiple evidential prophecies in the Old Testament.
There's many I didn't get into, absolutely.
Tied directly. And I'm just going off what the mission says.
Go back to your opening slide.
Why wouldn't
The very first
towards
one.
Christ is
The title.
my question.
If you read the title, how fulfilled prophecies show the Bible is divinely inspired. So the thesis statement here of going through these evidential prophecies, the thesis statement here the purpose was not to show that Christ is Lord, or that Christ was who he said he was. The mission statement here for this particular presentation is prophecies show the Bible is divinely inspired. So the entirety, if you take it off of that, the entirety of what the presentation is showing that the Bible contains prophecy, they're fulfilled, there's a certain criteria laid, and he hits exactly
well, I
what
appreciate your attempt to explain for him, but I was asking him, not you. And divine is Trinity, is God, Jesus Christ, and the Spirit. So anything to do with divine, and
I would say,
I'm just asking why during the entire presentation there was no messianic prophecy.
because we'll have a whole week on that. We'll also have whole weeks on like evidence for the resurrection, some of the things mentioned in the statement. We do, as our group, we tend to go pretty deep in an area and then go to a different topic and things like that. And so if you picture like if you're at a courtroom trial and you have someone making a case, in order to make their full cumulative case, they might have to go through several different lines of evidence. And when you put those together, you get a powerful cumulative case. And so I think that's what we try to do as a group. We'll go pretty deep into very particular areas like you mentioned. I appreciate that you want to get at some of those things, right? Because obviously I am a Christian. I'm a believer in Christ, that he was raised. I think there are good prophecies you can point to that are messianic. And we'll definitely get into those in future weeks. This was a very narrow scope for this week of just trying to help people see that God is the author of the whole Bible. There are things here, if you can show the trustworthiness of the Old Testament, that helps people accept prophecies of the Messiah in the Old Testament as well. So that's kind of the motivation. But yeah, believe me, I'm very pro-Jesus. I'm a Christian. That is the main point of the group. This is just looking at a very narrow topic, I guess you could say. I mean, sometimes we talk about science, and we think that there's arguments for God from science. We're not getting into the Trinity or Jesus in those either. But we think it part of a cumulative case, it can and actually has helped people that come in here not even believing in God, eventually realizing that there is a triune God and that Jesus died on the cross for them. And, that's the most important message. So I don't want to undercut that, but I do want to explain why we don't always delve into those details every single week, because we're trying to look at everything that would show that Christianity is true and not just particular areas. And one thing about this topic is that most people do not hear about this in church necessarily. You don't necessarily hear about Babylon being destroyed or whatever. You don't even, it's not mentioned. So I found that audiences like to learn some of these other details about prophecy that seem to show that hey, this seems like the kind of book that only God could have inspired someone to write. And I think there's value in that. But we have a couple hands, and then we're kind of out of time. You're okay. Josh?
I was going to say one of two things is, like you mentioned, we have some weeks where we move the scientific explanation of why we believe there is a higher power.
I've been here for those.
But the whole point is we don't go into Christianity itself. We think it's part of it to make a wider case. The other reason that we wouldn't take one messianic prophecies as specifically is because if someone doesn't believe that the word is divinely inspired and thinks it might have all been made up, then it doesn't really show a lot if it was already fulfilled in the time of the Bible several thousand years
Well,
ago.
I refer you back to what reasonable faith looks like.
Can I say, can I say, sir, about that as a chapter of reasonable faith, we can talk about whatever we want that has apologetic significance to the Christian faith. And I think you probably wouldn't disagree that fulfilled prophecies have apologetic significance to the Christian faith. So something that isn't necessarily... Yes, and we do that overall collectively as a cumulative case. Yeah.
You can talk about whatever you want. I never said anything
All right.
like that, so I don't understand your statement.
I don't think William Lane Craig is disappointed that we're talking about it either, the guy that formed these chapters. I think it's within the spirit and the realm of how they tend to run the chapters. You're looking at a lot of different evidential aspects. But go ahead, Ashton, real quick, and then we need to wrap it up here probably.
Well, yeah, I just want to say that there's also some prophecies in Ezekiel I really like about how Egypt would no longer project power beyond its borders after Nebuchadnezzar came in and stuff like that. So there's a lot of directions we could have gone, but overall I liked it. It's just, I think it's kind of difficult engaging with skeptics when it comes to arguing from prophecy, because some of it, like we did go over, is a little bit hyperbolic. Some of it isn't as clear-cut a fulfillment until like much later. And so to a skeptic, it could seem a little bit like proof texting in some cases, or it could seem a little bit like straining the literature. But yeah, I guess so. In terms of my question, is like which prophecies do you find I guess the most compelling, and how would you like use that evidence to persuade not only a doubting Christian but like a hardcore skeptic?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. It may not convince every skeptic, but I think if they're honest and they study these things, they would see that there's so much more fulfilled prophecy in the Bible than other religious books, and you see more dramatic, clear failures in other religious works. Most of them don't even actually have as much prophecy as the Bible. So, yeah, I mean, I think I gave you some of what I find the more compelling, at least the simple ones. I didn't get into the Egyptian ones too much, but I think you're right. I think it talks about the cities, Memphis and Thebes, that I did reference, and it talks about the country also in some very specific ways that seem to be definitely fulfilled. So, yeah, there's quite a few in there, and yeah, I would say if you want more information, get this book and look at those articles that I referenced. And yeah, let's go ahead and call it a day here. We're out of time, but thank you guys, and thank you for that input too about the reasonable faith. So appreciate that. All right.
Canes at Campbell and Coit.
Okay.
Hey, let me introduce myself. My name is Carlos.
Nice.
Your name?
Great to meet you too.